Next, we have Sangita, who's going to talk about her grandma. Sangita, your grandma.
In life, you'll always come across problems and challenges. Learn how to accept them with open arms and go with the flow. Today I'm going to share a story with you about my ba. And in all honesty, about 80 to 90% of what I'm about to tell you today, I've only just learnt in the last couple of weeks. And that's because I didn't know much about my ba and I had to question my dad a lot to find out. But I'd like to say thank you to Vaani for giving me this opportunity to actually learn a lot more about her. I hope you find it just as inspiring and interesting as I did. So my ba was born in India in the 1940s and she had 3 children. She had a young daughter who passed away sadly at a very young age. And then she had 2 sons, my dad and his twin brother, born at the same time, obviously a couple of seconds apart. But she raised them both by herself pretty much throughout her entire life. And there were 2 key reasons for that. Reason number 1 is because my papa spent the majority of his time away in Uganda for work purposes. And reason number 2 is because whilst he was out there in Uganda, he also ended up marrying another woman without my ba knowing, and without the other woman knowing that he was already married. So my ba eventually came to find out through villagers who were nearby, who also had relatives working in Uganda, that he'd married another woman. And one can understand that this must have been quite heartbreaking and shocking for her. But she still got along with life without any complaints. My ba was also illiterate, so she couldn't read or write or speak in English, Hindi or Gujarati. And that was another challenge that she also faced. She was born into a very big family. She had 7 brothers and 3 sisters. And life for her was primarily dominated by her elder siblings. Yet she managed to make sure that both my dad and his brother were raised right, and she gave them all the attention and care that she needed. And she used to work on the farm whilst doing so. Eventually, in the 1970s or so, my papa, who was in Uganda, decided to call my ba, my dad and his brother along, and he said, you know, come to Uganda, I'm over here, and it'd be good to have you all over there. I don't know why. But my ba decided, okay, fine, we'll go. It took them about 20 days or so, and they went by ship, and eventually they got to Uganda. When they got to Uganda, they weren't there for that long. They were there for around 3 months. And that's because at the time, there was a man called Idi Amin who dictated Uganda, and he'd said that he wanted all of the Indians thrown out of the country, and they had 90 days to do so. So within that time, the family had to think about, you know, where do they go next? And it was quite common around this time. People migrated to Canada, America. A lot of people went back to India, and many also came to the UK. My dad was only 7 years old at the time, but he decided that he really wanted to go to the UK, and that's because he knew his Masi was there. So they made the decision that they were going to go to the UK, and they went by plane, and they arrived at Stansted Airport. When they got to the UK, because of the living situation and the decisions that my ba and papa made, they ended up being separated yet again. So my papa and my step-ba, they ended up living in Middlesbrough, north of the country, almost near Scotland, whereas my ba, my dad and his brother, they ended up and found a home in Woolwich. And they ended up living life there. This was only supposed to be temporary, but it ended up being for their entire lives. As my ba settled in Woolwich with my dad and his brother, although she was illiterate, she managed to find a job in a textiles factory. And my dad and his brother, they went to school, and as they went to school, they also had multiple part-time jobs so that they could earn their way through life. So it was very hard growing up. Eventually, they were able to buy their first home, and that was quite difficult for my ba to have done and supported my dad in doing so, because she was a single parent raising 2 boys by herself who was illiterate. Put yourself in her shoes. Would you go to a country where you didn't know the language, where you didn't know if you'd have a roof over your head, where you didn't know whether you'd be able to get a job? I think I probably wouldn't. I wouldn't go to a country if I didn't know its language or, what life would be like there. It was quite a big risk that they were taking, but they managed to do really well for themselves. As my dad and his brother, they grew and they were in their teens, my ba became ill. Not only did she have diabetes, but she also had kidney failure, so she was on dialysis. This meant that my dad and his brother had to give my ba the attention and care that she needed, and it made things even more difficult. Despite this, my ba was still able to make sure that both my dad and his brother got married. So she was illiterate, she'd already lost one child, she'd come to a country where she didn't know the language and couldn't speak it. And on top of that, my papa, who lived in Middlesbrough, didn't attend the wedding. So she did it all by herself, all on her own. And in the 1980s, life was quite different, so you can imagine what society is thinking about the family situation. Yet, it didn't faze her and she just got on with it without complaining. I don't remember much about my ba, in all honesty. I feel like I should because I was around 8 years old when she passed away. But all I do remember is that me, my sister and my cousin, we used to go to the hospital quite regularly and would take our sweets and snacks with us and would spend all of our time getting up to mischief in the hospital waiting room. But having had this opportunity to learn about my ba, what I can say is that I've learned two things. Lesson number one is that if ever EastEnders or Star Plus is looking for a good storyline, they can probably definitely use this as one. And lesson number two, on a more serious note, is that in life we always have things that don't go our way. There's always obstacles, there's always problems. And we do tend to complain, it's part of human nature. But let's learn to take a step back and really reflect upon what's happening, and we'll realise that actually it's quite small and it's quite minute compared to these larger problems that not only my ba has experienced, but a lot of yours would have too. Namaste.